Good afternoon. I'm Cherie Stokes, Executive Director of Tech MGM. I'd like to welcome you to our kickoff event in celebrating National Computer Science Education Week. For the next 2 weeks, we're hosting and partnering with several companies and organizations throughout the River region to bring great events to the local community. STEM competitions for students, training for educators, and activities for IT professionals and entrepreneurs across the spectrum to learn more about computer science and IT within our local area. Today's Tech Forum is sponsored by Pinnacle Networks and features a very informative roundtable discussion on how startups can impact the digital transformation. Just this fall, the Montgomery TechLab was launched, and more recently, they have opened applications for their upcoming cohort. This tech accelerator aims to recruit companies with skills in digital services and mobile application development. But also local to Montgomery is the Program Executive Office for Business Enterprise Systems. They have successfully transitioned several applications to mobile platforms by leveraging small businesses and also operating as a startup themselves within BESPIN. They will bring some of their specific lessons learned to today's discussion, as well as an Air Force enterprise level perspective. In addition, we must also consider how accelerator programs have impacted not just digital services, but entire communities. The startup entrepreneur is a value add to any community, and encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation can truly transform a city. Now, let me introduce our panelists for the roundtable. First, Marcus Shaw, who's founding director of the Montgomery TechLab. Next, we have Rashim McKinney, who's also a program director with the Montgomery TechLab. And then Lloyd Whittall, user experience officer for the United States Air Force. Ria Patel, who's a senior government program manager with dcode. And Greg Godbout, who's also the Chief Growth Officer with Fearless Technologies. We'll also have Mr. James Crocker from the United States Air Force and BESPIN, their CTO, will join us later on in today's discussion. Now, we're going to discuss a few items of interest. As the new tech accelerator stands up, the Montgomery community really embraces startup entrepreneurs and also the Air Force and other commercial entities as they tackle digital services transformation. I'd like to encourage our viewers to submit any questions that you may have in the chat window. And as we discuss a variety of topics, we'll be sure to answer your questions, but take a listen to some of the items that we're going to hit just right off the bat. So one of the first things I kind of want to talk about amongst all of our panelists in this roundtable fashion is really what are some of the effects of having a robust and diverse startup community? Now, when you have something like that within your community, how does it really impact the tech and innovation ecosystem and culture? And I'll let you, Marcus, start off with that, just because I know you have some experience in that and what you've done with CoLab in Chattanooga, and then other ventures that you've had in the past.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Charisse, for inviting me to be a part of this panel and for the other panelists. What I've seen, not only in Chattanooga, but in Atlanta, in DC, and in a number of cities around the country, are that building a strong innovation culture and a strong innovation ecosystem is one of the best things a community can do to drive economic development, right? It's not just about creating a space where you can open up a new plant or that you can start a new factory, but in the 21st century, building a real critical mass around innovation and technology creates jobs, drives investments, and ultimately is really beneficial for a community. In Chattanooga, we've seen that some of the strongest companies that have come into the market over the past 5 years are startups. Some of the highest payers are startups, and companies that are able to attract talent and families to a city that are compelling and really helpful for growing that city are often startups as well. And so that means a lot. Being able to do that with a lens towards diversity really makes your city more competitive.
So if it's making you more competitive and it's also upping the game from a talent and a skill standpoint, Rashim, Would love for you to comment a little bit on how do you see that really impacting Montgomery? Since you're local to Montgomery, you have a good understanding of what that startup community looks like, but then also some of the voids that we may have in Montgomery.
Well, one of the things you have when you have growth in any environment, you have focus, and you have a focus on excellence. And when you can promote excellence in an environment, it becomes contagious and it begins to rub off in a lot of different ways. And I'm really excited about what you can do when you can promote a group of talented people just to be more focused on excellence and to be more focused on their craft and producing great products and great services. And we all get wins when you can create that kind of environment.
All right, so as you talk about excellence, I guess, Colt, that makes me definitely want to speak to you from the Air Force has loads of centers of excellence. And I've kind of coined that frame, across DoD for quite some time, be it in software applications or on the network side, certainly from an acquisition perspective. But now that you look at the user and digital transformation and the ability for this organization to seek towards becoming that mobile application center of excellence, how does that really play a part with what startups look to do?
Sorry, muted. So, the startup community typically has a really, really strong group of people that understand user experience and product design and development. They're very close to their customer, very close to their user. They have to be. And that's the kind of mentality, and those are the kind of skill sets that we need a lot more of in the government, particularly in DoD. And so what I would say is, regardless of what technology or what product it is that you're developing, those kinds of skill sets we need a lot more of in DoD, and that's kind of why my role was created. And if you look at, Charisse, you mentioned the centers of excellence, but what, they're really they're innovation centers. Some people would call them software factories. We do have a lot of those in the Air Force. And the reality is that almost any technology development shop in the Air Force can be a software factory if they want to be. They have to kind of play ball and do certain things with certain tools, with certain skill sets. But one of the things that they need to do is they need user experience capabilities. So then that's that's where I come in, but that's also where you come in, and that's where the startup community comes in. Like I said, we need companies, we need vendors, we need people, we need resources that know how to be close to the customer, close to the user, and meet needs.
Now, when you say that as something that the Air Force is not only honing on specifically, I think, Greg, you would probably be able to speak from an immediate experience on the ability to service a government or Air Force customer in that same realm, be it your work that you all have had within BESPIN and the ability to really hone in on what the user and what the customer is looking for. Would you say that as a startup, in that field, in that community, what has led you all to be successful because of the way you're either structured and or the programs that you have within your company?
Yeah, well, again, it centers around, as you alluded to, it centers around that design thinking, that human-centered design, user-centered design approach. If you look back at the last 30, maybe 40 years in government, what you'll find is lots of new technologies came to government, but none of the behaviors changed, and they weren't able to maximize, at a large part, the value of that technology. And any startup who's really close to, and I agree with Colt, that startups are close to their customers. They're right there, and they know that implementation of their technology, let's say they're a product company, or if they're a consulting company, the process in which they bring together multiple services to deliver is just as important as the actual technologies. And so what you have right now is I think it's a great time for small businesses actually to come work with government, because you have these labs that are primarily set up to change the behaviors of government and processes around bringing these technologies in. And so it increases that chance of success. And so, a new company coming in, you should insist on that design thinking approach and push for that. There's people in the government now thinking actively about that, and these labs will be supportive of that.
So if you're going to push for that and you're going to encourage it, I guess, Ria, because you all have worked with not only Air Force customers from a government standpoint, but several government entities, and really doing that matchmaking for a lot of that startup community. Are you able to really identify within those startups? So what's not necessarily the secret sauce, but what are you looking at that says, this is going to be a startup company that's going to match well with what the government is looking for from a customer and user delivery standpoint?
Absolutely. That is the billion-dollar question for sure. And I think part of why Decode exists, right, is that something that is really, really difficult, and especially with DoD and Air Force is one example of this, is just the barrier to entry around language and acronyms and use case is so different from commercial sector. And so a lot of what we do, and a lot of what I help every sort of startup work through, is what commercial applications, what is your niche in your market segment, and how do you translate that into a use case that DoD understands, right? So a lot of it is taking use cases and applications in other highly regulated industries like energy and insurance and healthcare and financial, and understanding how that applies to a use case that DoD actually has. And a lot of that is also sort of translating into mission requirements. So DoD, a lot of the speak, right, is around mission sets and how you're going to contribute to a certain mission and programmatic requirements, and understanding how to go from understanding your use case in commercial, as well as how you're going to map to what that solution looks like in DoD, is very difficult. But once you crack that code and you're able to speak very fluidly in DoD language, so to speak, it really makes the whole market a lot easier to understand and ascertain, as well as navigate. So that's what I recommend, is really understanding your commercial use cases, and then understanding how to translate that very well into DoD speak, which is also probably the hardest part.
So as you talk about that, it makes me think about something, and I know Rashim will feel my pain here, as well as Greg, just on, we could be knee deep in government DoD jargon. And I think a lot of times we will get submerged so much into that we're losing the fact that our government customers really need to have a better understanding of what happens outside of their gate, and truly start to leverage a lot of the best practices that are happening in commercial industry and within those entities. And I asked Colt, I would love to hear, how do we do a better job? And I say we as a collective industry, how do we do a better job of leveling that playing field and having that joint language that still allows for that degree of innovation to come in, and allows those startup niche companies to really be able to solve those tough problems that we've probably over government jargonized, or for lack of a better made up word for today, on being able to say, yes, we're open for innovation. We want new things, even though it doesn't sound like we do.
Well, good question. So, there's kind of all the standard ways. I think the CIBR program is amazing. To be honest with you, I didn't know a lot about it for years and probably should have. And I think, I don't know who knows my background, but I come from the commercial world, and, 18 months ago took this role. So I'm new to the government. So there's that. And then, of course, some of the things that we're doing, with AFWorks and are obviously phenomenal. But beyond that, I think you have to just be engaged. There's no substitute for you know, you're following people that are, you know, like, you know, Nick Shalon, myself, and many others in government that are pretty open about talking about the kinds of stuff that we're dealing with. And, you know, keeping an eye out for that, because, you know, we're pretty honest about it. You know, I will tell you some of the kind of, you know, business problems, for lack of a better word, that we deal with in UX, you know, are discussed fairly openly in UX forums and on LinkedIn. And I don't go into a whole lot of specifics, but you know, I mean, Nick Shalon has been known to crowdsource ideas and crowdsource solutions, and I've done a little bit of that myself. So there's a whole lot of there's all the usual means of engaging, and then there's all of the kind of unofficial means of engaging that are fast and efficient. I'll tell you, there's content that I've put into white papers about how we're going to solve specific problems that was heavily informed by things that I learned from engaging with professionals on topics like user research and measuring user experience. And, you know, we're actually trying to now implement some of those ideas. So it's, you know, I'm just here to tell you that there's all of the official things, and those are good, and I think they're great programs. And frankly, when I was on the industry side, I probably didn't leverage that kind of thing as much as I should have. Lesson learned. But there's also a lot of unofficial channels that people use, including myself, Nicholas, and many others. So just be cognizant of those.
And if I may, Sherry, because I love the original question, I think one thing hopefully everyone can agree with on this panel is that when the jargon usually comes from the solutions and maybe a poor understanding of the root cause of a problem, but pain points are universal and everybody understands pain points. And when we shift the conversation around engaging with government and industry around problems and pain points, then that is a common language that everyone can agree to, and it really makes it more of a collaborative engagement and understanding around getting to the best solution, versus I think a lot of times the acronyms and the nuance of the languages spoken comes out of talking in different methods around the solution. So that's my opinion there.
No, I mean, when you speak to pain points, Marcus, I think you could also speak to the fact that you've seen similar pain points on the healthcare sector and, you know, throughout other tech accelerators or accelerator programs that you've managed. When you look at those pain points and challenges, do we have to really customize for a government customer? Are we really customizing for digital services or mobile application? Or would you say there's maybe some common denominators across some of those?
Got to unmute.
Thank you, sir. I would say that there are a number of common denominators between the healthcare sector and the government at large, and certainly the military. These are large system-based organizations that, you know, to the outsider can seem bureaucratic. And I think the language of the entities is incredibly important to success. One of the things that we've seen with healthcare, and I think this would also be true for working with the government, is finding a path of innovation that may be different than a path as a vendor, right? So building strategic partnerships, finding folks that you can collaborate with as you work through that agile process, as you work through that design and human-centric design process is incredibly important for success, particularly when you're working with a large system. And so I think Colt's dead on. I think Greg, the sentiment that he shared around moving towards a user-centric design, that type of thinking, the Colt that you've had in the private sector is exactly what's going to be successful, I think, in the government sector. And I'm sure that's part of the reason why you're there. But I think accelerators can help companies bridge that gap faster in terms of working with commercial or private sector folks and then making that transition to work with the government.
So if a startup is, you know, deciding, hey, I may not have an individual customer base. I haven't decided yet if it's going to be completely commercial or if I'm going after, government customers or government clients only. For example, Greg, when you all have individual companies that may come through Hutch and may come through the programs that Fearless has run, have you had to change the way that you're mentoring or coaching those companies based on maybe who they perceive their client to be and or maybe who they perceive that product would best service?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I can't give like a blanket specific answer except to say that we do a lot of coaching and training and teaching on how to work with the federal government, right? And but we do recommend that they also seek out commercial contracts and things like that. I mean, the nice thing about a commercial contract is if you convince the product manager or the manager at the client site that they want to buy it in a small commercial setting, they can just cut you the check and make that deal happen, right? So that's pretty advantageous, right? Now on the federal side, I've always frequently joked with people, there's like two sales on the federal side. You have to first sell the program lead on the technology and idea, and then you have to also do the contracting and the acquisition side of it. And it's like two different worlds. So it's harder, and it often turns off a lot of small businesses. So them understanding the benefits of that, like if you're a new business and you're getting started, if you can win, if you join an accelerator program like this, right, and you can get a small contract or a small piece that is technically a government contract, you may not be thinking about this now, but banks value that much higher than they value your short commercial contract that you just won. And it's not just banks, it's potential investors. And it's also this, like, how are you going to stabilize yourself early on? Are you going to constantly be rushing and hustling and talking to people to win those like commercial contracts? Or do you jump on board with a current contract and bring a staff member on that's maybe 5 years long, right? So there's advantages and disadvantages to both. If you can balance both, it'd be good. A great commercial company is excellent at like capacity or capability delivery, right? To be good in the commercial side, you want to bring that capability delivery to the thing. A great like government company has a way to like not only do capabilities, but also the contractual and the business and the structural things that a business needs to be successful too. So it's a good balance if you can do both, but make sure you treat both differently.
So knowing that, and if you have to look at that business side, that acquisition side, whether you're doing commercial or government, but then you're also looking at the ability to deliver, would you say, and I think this may be for you, Ria, when you look at companies that are coming into programs and you're starting to coach those companies on one, how to do business just in general, and you're providing mentoring and coaching, what does that focus really look like from a programmatic standpoint? Because some tech accelerator programs are 5 weeks long, some are 12 weeks long. The emphasis that you have on that business side, I think, is very important from just the ability to grow companies that have long-term sustainability. Like, we're not just trying to grow the next one-hit wonder and this company isn't around, 6 months from now. Does it really change your programming and how you mentor, coach, and or train those companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's our focus, is helping companies grow sustainable businesses. And I think one of the hardest points, and Greg hit on this, right, is balancing commercial growth with federal growth. And a lot of the companies we're working with have significant traction in the commercial market, are new to US federal, and understanding how to manage both in parallel without sort of detracting from the other is a very difficult thing. And a lot of our program is geared around that. How do you simultaneously grow a business while maintaining your commercial traction, your commercial growth, while entering the US federal market? And I think one of the biggest pieces, and a lot of companies fall in, and startups in particular fall in this trap early on when entering federal, is how do you make resourcing decisions and growth decisions? So when do you hire your first federal salesperson? Do you keep that in-house for quite a bit of time? How do you sort of strategically grow your federal team and your business pipeline when you enter a new market? And so a lot of our programming is not only around helping a company understand how to sort of manage financials when you're entering a new market and sort of managing parallel growth, but it's also a lot of those really tough strategic resourcing questions and growing a business without going under in your first 3 months because you grew too fast, or maybe you grew too slow, right? And you missed a really crucial revenue growth section of your business. And so a lot of our programming, I think a lot of accelerator programming in general aims to really help companies understand that, to take out some of the risk of understanding what is a strategic priority versus what is something that is going to have that company flounder in a couple of months.
So knowing that and knowing that you have to look at the changes there and the ability to start mentoring and coaching on that. Rashim, you and I have been in Montgomery 15 plus years easily, and we have a pretty decent understanding of what the lay of the land looks like here, be it traditional companies that are used to supporting your Maxwell Air Force Base, Gunner Annex, and a lot of your traditional DoD customers. Is that the same fit for where the Air Force is going now compared to what that startup scene could look like or would look like with the proper mentoring and coaching to really start to go after a lot of what Colt's talking about, some of the transformation that's needed, the types of companies that Rhea is talking about doing tech scouting on? Do we have that, and how do we help grow that?
So when you look at some of the most innovative environments on the planet, like look back the last 100 years of American history, what have been some of our most innovative moments? You kind of look at that data and you correlate it to different factors in those spaces, and you start seeing some trends. And a lot of them are happening right here on the ground in Montgomery today. A vibrant art scene, when you start seeing art come to life in the city, it's something happening in that soil. We've been seeing that in Montgomery for the last 5 years, especially heavy. The King's Canvas, 21 Dreams, Arts and Culture, I mean, really transforming how people think about culture itself, how people think, the framework of forming concepts for some people that have been in a space for so long is hard. And when you bring something along that makes someone think about something differently, that's when you have growth and the potential for transformation. And that's what we have in the city right now. So the more talent that we can attract, the more diversity, and diversity is a term that's so often used, but what are we talking about? You know, diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity of interest. When we bring people to the table and we're solving problems, you will be amazed at what a room of diverse thinking can produce. I grew up in the space world, and I launched satellites that sometimes didn't work when they got to space, and people on the ground had to figure out how to fix them or throw a couple billion back into the coffers of the United States government. Your pick. But people produce, but they have to be given an opportunity and they have to be given a voice to participate in the problem-solving process.
Okay, so knowing that, and knowing that we have that sort of culture change, that one engenders that type of growth and starts to attract those skills, that talent base. How do we then take those individuals and that, I don't want to say newfound innovation and newfound spirit and culture, and really start to let that spread and impact the community? So I don't want to say I think, but I know you've done that in Chattanooga, Marcus, and I know that's also happened in Baltimore, Greg. How have you been able to kind of channel those changes within the community to then change how you're operating within that startup and that tech world to really impact change in a greater, larger effort?
Yeah, I'll start. In Chattanooga, a big part of it, and I think this is why the Air Force is so important to Montgomery, it starts with, who are your industry players, your anchor industries. And those industries are going to bring people in and they're going to cycle people out. And if you can keep people, and Rashim is it's the perfect example of this, right? If you can keep some of your best and brightest, once they've cycled out of the military, they're civilians, they're civil servants, whatever, if you can keep them engaged with some of the most exciting things in the community, adding on to that culture of arts and all of the civic stuff that we talk about, but you provide an opportunity for people to get high skill, high paying jobs. That's what technology does. Then you're creating this culture. And we've seen that again in Chattanooga. Some of our top performing companies are freight and logistics companies. And that is an industry that's been an anchor of Chattanooga for over 150 years. So as those companies start to delve more into technology and creating more progressive jobs, they're getting more progressive people that want to stay and grow and drive GDP and community wealth. And so it becomes a cyclical process with the community. But I think, the Air Force, I think Alabama Power, a couple of companies and industries that have a real foothold there in Montgomery can do well to complement some of that grassroots culture that's building that Rashim talked about.
Greg?
Yeah, it's interesting, Marcus, as you were talking and sort of what Rashim was talking about. I was thinking about COVID, right? And like the changes that COVID has done, and I mean, I myself have always been. I have different interests. I own a comedy club. I ski a lot. There's a lot of strange things that I do that don't seem to make sense that they're all grouped together. But nonetheless, right? It's always because I've always felt, and I've had this saying that I work to live. Right? Like my work and my stuff is so that I can live and be passionate about things, right? And that's what arts are. That's what a community is. That's what like these things are. And I think that like for a lot of people that I worked with for many, many years, they pretty much lived to work, right? It was they moved as close to work as possible. They lived in dense area. They picked these certain things, and that if cities and towns and stuff don't, and rural areas, like people are going to start looking at this like, well, wait, I could be remote maybe half the time. If I'm going to be remote half the time, where would I work? Right. And really what you think about is really, where do you want to live? Like, where do you want to, and like arts and a vibrant scene like that, that's going to drive that there's a bunch of like books that talk about like hiring people, and some of them there's this one theory that you don't hire anyone that doesn't have a fantastic hobby. Right. And there's something to that. Right. So I think that like owning that, like the government should own that, the cities should own that. People should think about like, let's start thinking about people living more and a little bit less about what they're working on. And I think you'll find talent will attract to that.
So I can honestly say in some of the discussions that I've sat in on, some of the more recent briefings, even from senior government leadership, not just on an Air Force side, but DOD across the board. And I think, Colt, you can probably agree that we've seen this from our new CIO, Deputy CIO, with Lauren Knossenberger and other leaders, certainly within AFMC, that are basically saying we have to change the way we're looking at not just our people and our talent, but changing the way that we're choosing to do business and to develop software. And I think when we look at the focus of the Montgomery TechLab really being digital services and mobile application development, and knowing that that is a huge piece of the pie from an Air Force app perspective, certainly from a BES and overall application, are we starting to see those trends across leaders and really how they do day-to-day business that's changing that culture side of how the Air Force is operating, how they're taking on new ideas, how they're training and learning, that will now allow this innovation to start to happen and essentially bring more individuals into the fold? Because I think it's almost as if you have that right role model, then you're essentially starting to recruit that pipeline of companies and programs that will support that. Are you seeing it at your level, I would say, and within your peer of individuals that kind of have that responsibility too?
Sorry, had to unmute. I think so. I know that's kind of a mealy-mouthed answer, but I think so. I'm still seeing a little bit of, well, I would say a fair amount of sort of the big IT program thing in government, right? You got a big set of requirements. They all go through acquisition. There's a giant solicitation, a bunch of giant prime integrators bid on it, and it all gets awarded as a giant package with a 5-year, 10-year timeline and yada, yada, yada. Maybe they pick some small businesses, maybe they don't. That's kind of the old model of acquiring even software. And it's a horrible model for acquiring software. Don't like that model. I'm not the only one. If you go all the way to Dr. Roper, that's not the model we want to be in. The model we want to be in is more of the software factory kind of model, and that has many implications. If you look at the way these groups are doing business, they go to smaller contractors. They put together kind of a semi-badgeless sort of environment. So it's a mix of government people and contractor people all side by side in an environment that's more collaborative and engages our end users, our airmen, in the process of software development. That's kind of the model we want to get to. And then part of my job is help change the minds of the people that keep driving those giant acquisitions and convince them that, no, you don't want to do that giant acquisition. What you really want to be doing is you want to drive your requirements into this new kind of software model. So I'm sort of like, would be a good example. I was about to say a shepherd, but it's really more of a cowboy, right? My job is I got to get all these folks headed. I want to take big user experience problems and needs, and instead of letting them go the traditional route, I want to drive them and herd them into this new model where they could take advantage of people like you guys. That's a big part of my job. And frankly, I don't think I do enough of it yet, and probably need to be spending a lot more time on it. I am trying to do that, by the way. And my focus, frankly, is on systems that affect the entire Air Force, because we have a lot of systems, probably north of 25, maybe north of 50 systems with upwards of 600,000 users, right? I mean, that's big IT. That's digital product realm. So that's kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, Charisse, but I think things are kind of changing, but it's going to take more than software factories, because as Nick Shalon says, any software group in the Air Force can become a software factory. That's good, but that's not sufficient. What's sufficient and necessary is that we go beyond that, and we dismantle this way of developing software and move these things through the software factories and the different model that they're using. And frankly, I think that's better for the Air Force, better for the airmen. It's better for small businesses that serve the Air Force. It's just a different way of doing business for everybody. Over. I'm learning, by the way, when I'm done talking to say over.
Charisse, I would love to, if I could, just throw a question out there. And I think Colt, you just kind of touched on thinking about cowboying some of the conversations and discussions about software development that are happening in the Air Force to the startup community. What can the startup community, what can a startup that is not really thought about working with the government, and Rhea, I know you do a lot of this as well, thinks that the barrier to entry might be too high? Are there ways to lower that barrier to entry for a community of startups so they can find a path? I mean, SBIR is a great one, but maybe for other types of organizations that can find a path towards finding a customer with the Air Force or other military outfits.
So directed at me?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'll give you what we did. And if you're a product company, you're probably not going to like this very much. And I'll be straight with you. I think the barriers to entry as a services company are lower, in my opinion. They just are. You know what I mean? Unless you have a product that is all of a sudden in exactly at the right spot at the right time. By the way, Zoom Gov last April, we couldn't get enough Zoom Gov. All right. Just letting you know. I mean, it was unbelievable. Everybody in the Air Force all of a sudden had to have Zoom Gov. But other than those right product at exactly the right time situations, I think the barriers to entry as a services company are just lower. And I think building relationships in the community, knowing how to hustle and get on contracts as a sub, and then go after things as a prime are invaluable skills. But everybody knows, there's a million services companies that branch and launch into product companies.
Yeah.
And so, that's a way, if you have a vision for a product and you want to get into DoD, to lower the barrier of entry and sort of go forth and build relationships. It's one way to do it. And then, of course, there's all the other channels that you already mentioned that we don't have to talk about. But it's just my 2 cents. And by the way, that's the way we did it. I was with a little spin-off design shop, design development shop. I'll tell you how we got into the government. It was because we were a implementation partner of a software company that ultimately the software company failed. But it got us in the door. And so it got us in the door. We built relationships. And then we never became a product company. We didn't want to, but we in effect built a product.
That's super helpful. Charisse, do you have audio here?
I think I do. Can you hear me okay?
You're back.
Great. So, in listening to what Colt just said, of what I got a chance to hear, with respect to having those good partnerships and leveraging those partnerships, I think a lot of existing companies that are doing work within Montgomery or within certain areas want to know, does this mean that they're locked out of business because there's a focus on the startup scene? Do they have a role in growing startup entrepreneurs? And what would that role look like? Rhea, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, because I know you all leverage a lot of partners, and certainly Marcus as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think partners in sort of, I always say like bigger industry, but industry is so critical for startups to grow, and also to quickly see revenue, especially in a market like federal. And one of the reasons I say that is because at least from my experience, a good tech startup is a product company, and it has a very niche market segment and a very niche product that it wants to maintain, and really sort of grow over the next couple of years. And oftentimes, especially with DoD, right? DoD is looking for a much bigger solution, a much bigger program, a much bigger system, not the single startup that has a very small facet of a solution that it can be provided. And so partnerships and strategic partnerships and teaming is so critical, I think, for a lot of startups, at least very early stage companies and companies that are new to federal, to actually get their foot in the door. And I think vice versa, right? Industry and these bigger companies have the experience of working with government, working in really highly regulated industries where in general, the barriers to entry are pretty high. And so for resource constrained startups where you don't have an entire capture team like a lot of these bigger systems integrators or consulting firms or companies do, it is so necessary. And it's sort of like a creative way to leverage your own company and to save resources, to partner with these bigger industry players who have the experience and the bandwidth, but also know that in order to stay working with government and in order to sort of like stay positioned to be the company that they are, they need to partner with these really innovative and cutting edge technologies. And I think we've seen a lot more of that recently, this appetite from industry and from these partners to actually seek out working with startups. Whereas in the past, it was a little bit more of a contentious relationship. I actually think right now is a really phenomenal time to work with industry and these sort of existing players.
Yeah, I'll just add 2 cents to Rhea's point, which I think is absolutely important. Building a strategic relationship is important. Rashim, was an acquisition officer, and I did not know that he was putting $1 billion worth of satellites in the sky. But I assume, there are hundreds of companies that participate in the supply chain of, bringing those satellites up and getting them up in space. And so when we look at what companies that can benefit the type of agenda that we're pushing, it can be the startup company that's developing software. It can be an existing company that's developing, certain components of the satellites or certain components of systems that are used to manage those. I mean, Rashim, I know as an acquisitions officer, you did a lot of this. And they're not all startups, right? I mean, some are existing companies. How did you think about those, and how did they benefit Montgomery as well?
So when you look at when you take that design thinking approach, you assume that you know nothing. Like, you look at the problem and you say, what can I observe? What can I verify? Just basic problem solving through and through. And then they have this term called empathy, right? I like that term a lot because it forces you to get inside of the person that has the problem, get inside that operator's head. And we did a lot of that. When you're building training manuals, you need someone who understands what's going on with the operator, because you're teaching this person what they're supposed to do, the right way to do it. So you have to be very thorough in how you do that. And it has to be very, very much integrated in your technology and your software, because it's all got to be in sync. So if you're going to have a team, you have to be able to communicate, and you have to be able to value other people's strengths and let them do what they're good at. So it's this symbiotic thing where you just it's a seamless team, and everybody has what they're good at and their talent, and you're able to harness that in an efficient manner, and that creates that competitive advantage. And that's how we're able to be more efficient. And once you taste that, you're always trying to get back to that, because you know how awesome and how special that is.
So a little taste of that greatness, right? And
Right.
and a taste of being able to have that progress. I'd love to introduce James Crocker, Guido, who is actually the CTO at BESPIN. You guys have had an opportunity to at least pat yourselves on the back for having some greatness and having some growth within the organization as a whole. What have you been able to maybe glean or learn from a best practices standpoint on operating as a startup yourselves, and how it's really helped you all to progress over the last, I don't want to say few months, because it's probably at least a year now?
Thank you, and hello everybody. So please call me Guido, that's my go by. And so the whole startup piece is super difficult, because essentially we scaled from within BESPIN from PEO Bez from about 8 people to about 280 in about a year and a half, which was almost a nightmare. But when you think about that many people and that many directions, and doing an enterprise capability for the Air Force, and 15 different contract efforts and all that stuff, so it was very difficult. What I will say is, don't take no for an answer. Like, whatever you do when people are like, oh, you can't do that. Okay, so there's a way I can do it, what you're saying. Like, always find that piece and never lose sight of essentially the user. Everything we did, every success we had with the user just gave us more fuel for the fire. Every time we crossed another hurdle, every time we got that other thing delivered, it was just like, all right, let's build the next thing and build the next thing. And I guess to comment on some of the earlier, like the conversation when I came in, is definitely focus on build a family of people. Don't just go out and say, oh, well, they're the biggest people, or they're the cheapest people, or whatever. You really need to focus on who's going to do the best job, who's going to really build the larger kind of family of small businesses, so that you can continue to build off each other, so that you can continue to essentially have all of those cogs in the machine that are all getting better and better, because one alone won't work. It has to be essentially a group of groups to do that. It also allows you to build a better product for your environment. So if you have something that you're building that is playing off of somebody else's, you've just increased your ability to scale and your ability to manipulate. So definitely build out that family of people in order for your startup to grow and to build, and don't lose sight of the users. Always, everything we do is user based, and anytime you can, we bounce stuff like off of Colt, and always trying to, are we doing the right thing? Are we focused? And that really helps you to to get, big and to do great things.
So from a technology aspect, I think as we've talked about building that family, building that network, that focus on the pain points, focus on the customer, what about from a technology side of the house? Are there common denominators that we're seeing across the commercial, government sector, DoD, and/or I would say even Fed Civ from a sheer technical standpoint that these are common denominators. These are issues that everyone is having. Is it, for example, you may say it's, hey, iOS development, or it's, applying the right security controls to mobile applications. Are there certain aspects that you would say are in higher demand than others?
The one that's the hardest is design thinking. Like, understand the problem, understand how to diagnose, how to build towards a user. I think that's the commonality for everybody. And, Colt, Mr. Whittall, this is probably going to be your area, but everybody should have that same focus. I don't care what tech you have, we'll all have, AWS or Azure, or GCP, we'll have all those pieces. We'll have different versions of serverless or those different pieces. Those mean nothing. That commonality needs to be the user piece, the user engagement, the design research, and building that and understanding the empathy of the user, as Mr. McKinney said earlier, is the empathy is the one thing you have to understand. You can't answer something in a binary manner. So if I'm answering a contract, does it do that? Check the box. No, that's not what we need to do. Focus on the user. Does it answer what they need? Don't check that box. Understand what they need. Test it with them. Ensure. So just to reiterate, all that piece before the development, that's something we all share. That's something that we all need to be focused on, because if we do that, everything else is cake.
Guido, I'm right with you. And I will tell you this, just a story to reinforce that. So I'm not going to name names, but there's a major program that I've been, advising is not really the right word. I've been attempting to advise without success because there's a bit of, call it tissue rejection or whatever you want to call it. For many months. And so they have gotten to the point where I think they have a product that they're going to roll out to almost the entire Air Force. Well, no, it's the entire Air Force. And this particular, we'll call it a product, but think it's a web application that everybody will use. They have not had users involved. They really haven't followed a user-centered design process. They've been pretty scrappy in getting access to development resources to do it. But I think they assumed that because they're using some COT software for a large part of the product, that maybe they had all the user experience bases covered, but they never had users involved in the project in any significant way. They did a little bit of research, but and so now I think they're finally listening to me, because I don't think they like what they've got, and I don't think users like what they've got. And so they want to have a workshop where I'm pretty sure, and they've got some outside, experts coming in. And I'm pretty sure what they want is they want us to come in and give them a thumbs up or a rubber stamp that we like the user experience. And, my opinion of the user experience is totally irrelevant, right? It's completely irrelevant. I'm not the target audience of this. I mean, I'll be a user. The target audience, are your, various archetypes of Air Force users, right? So, picture them. That's who our target audience is. And I'm one of the outliers, right? I'm 52 years old guy working out of my house in Atlanta. I'm an outlier. And so that's the conversation I'm having with them. That's literally the email that I was starting to write before this session started is, wait a minute, I'm happy to join your meeting, but you got to rethink how you're engaging with end users and incorporating them into your design process, or there's no point.
Yeah. So this all goes back to the one thing I keep saying is doing things with people and not to people. If you can remember that, easy.
So if you're going to do that and you're going to do things with people, be it your target audience, potential customers, your client base, as you're going through an accelerator program, and if a startup company comes to the portion where they're getting ready for their demo day, their pitch day, how do you use that feedback, Marcus and or Greg? How do you use that feedback that you're giving to those companies to now shape them to be ready to say, hey, now you're ready to pitch to one, get more funding, and or to really start to sell your product? Because in my head, if we're mentoring, coaching, and training those startup companies, we're getting them ready for that demo day. What does that prep look like?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's very clear, and I think it's certainly true in the commercial world and for investors, but it seems like it's also very, very much true for the government. If you haven't talked to customers, then you're not ready to really demo your product formally as a product or a service, right? You've got to have some customer discovery process. And I think more and more as we move into this design thinking and human-centric process, you've got to think about that in a way that is, rigorous, right? It's not enough to say, look, I went out and I tested this with my niece and my nephew and my uncle and my aunt, right? There is an increasingly scientific approach to design thinking. It's becoming more rigorous. I say it's the new engineering. And I think that if you are a startup and you're looking to talk to a credible customer like the Air Force, right? You've got to have that as part of your pitch. And, how did that change any of your design, any of your implementation, any of your business or go-to-market process? And you can share that with people, right? That's oftentimes a slide in a deck.
Greg?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like it's design thinking and user-centered design is just so widely not used. I've yet to walk into a project, a new engagement that was looking to do digital transformation or digital services transformation, and yet to walk in and have them actually following the right North Star. And what I mean by that is they were building their application to what would have been a guaranteed angry end user, right? And this is where you get to like statistics like 85 to 94% failure rates of non-adoption of systems being delivered in the government. I mean, many of these systems, users have been on it, they're atrocious. They're absolutely atrocious. And so those you can imagine no user would like doing these, but even the ones that were like styled nicely or done like this, it missed the point. Right. And the only way you're going to hit that point, and we're all susceptible to this, by the way, like I know user-centered design practitioners who get into the heat of like, we got to build an application, we got to deliver something, we got to get something out the door. And they go, don't worry, I know the users. I know the users. I mean, I can't count the number of times I've heard an executive tell me, don't worry, I know the users. And the truth is we don't. And the users don't even know themselves until they put their hands on it. So it's like, it's an impossible thing to figure out without a rapid going back and forth with the users and evolving it. But like to your point and to the question, it's interesting because if I'm going in and I'm a new startup and I'm going to pitch my thing, right? If you're talking about your technology and you're sort of dwelling on the technology, you're probably, with a few exceptions of some people on this call or a few exceptions of some engineers, you might do well, but you're probably not going to do well, right? But if you walked in and you had already had reviews of actual users, like actual, maybe airmen and women or people who've actually used the system or saw a demo and they liked it, your chances of getting through that door and being successful are so much higher. Because the one thing I will say is all the systems I walked into that none of them were doing human-centered design, when they first went through the discovery with the users and they got that moment of truth that, oh boy, we're going in a different direction. And then they learned they saw the actual quotes and they saw the statistics and they saw they loved it and they were never going back, right? I want this data all the time. I need a person like this on my team. I want this data continuously. Now, getting them to that point was very difficult, but all of these stakeholders and all these managers, when they see it, if you can walk in with that material as part of your sales pitch, it's golden, you know?
And pilots, pilots are incredibly helpful to get that kind of intel that Greg's talking about. I mean, the point is to be able to walk into a prospective customer, a prospective investor, a prospective JV, and to say, I talked, or we've worked through a process with either a strategic pilot or a program pilot or a customer, an early adopter customer, and we changed our direction, or we made a change to our product or our process or the way that we engage somebody, particularly if that's an institution that prospective customer or investor knows, that is like gold in the world of a startup, right? If Colt's former company was a prospective customer or pilot for an organization, for a startup, and they're talking to Colt and they're saying, you know what, we tested this with a bunch of different integration companies, and we really determined that our software was not appropriate for these end users, but it worked really well for these end users. And Colt can say, I know that person. That all of a sudden gives a lot of credibility to the pitch. Again, whether you're looking for capital or whether you're looking for a client.
But I think Colt also spoke to that early on, where we talked about just the value of the SBIR program. So the SBIR program certainly is giving that startup funding, and that phase two, part of that phase two is really that customer discovery and the ability to do that data researching and mining and go back to the customer and say, so let's try this out for a little while. That's how that program is set up. And I think one of the value adds that we're seeing from Montgomery TechLab, just relationship to BES, to BESPIN, and to Air Force as a whole is the ability to use programs like the SBIR program and to use organizations like AFRL, AFWorks, and others to be able to have that landing strip to bring small businesses, to bring startups, and to bring entrepreneurs through. And correct me if I'm wrong, Colt and Greg, I think that's some of the goodness that we see in that relationship and partnership.
Agree. Yeah, agree.
Yeah, no, I do, Colt, I want to go back to something kind of related to this, but something you mentioned before, which is important, is I think they do expect you to walk in and be like, well, because I'm in charge of human-centered design, I agree that this is good design, right? Like this sort of over-reliance on the SME, right? I think there's this need for this synergy of us understanding, like it's getting away from stakeholder-centered design and to user and human-centered design. So full on agree.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I mean, the thing that I always find, just kind of crazy about this argument, which I've been having with people for years, wouldn't it just be easier, frankly, to just engage actual users, especially if your client is, we can make them available. It's sometimes difficult logistically, right? But we can, all right? We really can. And I mean, to be honest with you, even if we can't, if the Air Force literally, if you're a contractor to the Air Force and the Air Force says, well, I just can't make 5 airmen available. All right, well, I'll tell you what you do. You go to the exchange on base. There's all kinds of ways, And when I was in the commercial world, we were working for Avis, and the way that we interviewed Avis customers was we rode around in the bus going back and forth between the airport and the lot. Okay. And we did it without the consent of Avis sometimes. So, it's not hard to engage airmen in user-centered design if you get creative. And it just seems to me it would make life a lot easier for everybody, right? I mean, as a contractor, you're going to be more confident. The Air Force can be more confident. So anyway, I'm sure I'll be having this debate with people for quite a while.
Yes, Colt, just to add to that, and I want to add something that Rashim said earlier about empathy, right? And the only other word that I would add to that is not just the empathy of like imagining you're in that person's shoes, but also sort of the we have, I think, ingrained in humans, all of us, is this desire to be an expert or to know or to have the answer, right? And I really think that like people go in, oh, I'm behind human-centered design, I'm behind user-centered, like go for it, go. But I know, like that knee-jerk sort of like guttural reaction is very human, right? And it's and that's what we have to fight. Like you like what that means for like government, right, is like changing governance, right? That if you want to try new software, you need to bring 2 users in your community who want to use the software and tell you what the value will be. And if you don't get the value, we won't add it to the new software list. Instead, what happens in government, it's like go through a crazy process that's going to take months and years and fill out a bunch of paperwork, and just eventually like someone in technology or CIO's office will approve the software or not. Well, there was no test. There was nothing with real users of whether it provided value. Instead, we have to change everything and the finance and all that stuff. So there's so many internal processes in government that have to embrace this sort of like a good manager is a manager that admits they don't know. Let's go discover it. Let's find out,
Yeah.
and that's a hard thing to shift for people.
I think what the funniest thing about this is that, I've got over 20 years of software development and solving problems. Is 99% of the time when you're doing something, when you have a contract, when you're focused on something, you're making a product that solves a problem. So you have a problem. Anytime you have a problem, you have a large group of people that are literally like right next door that want to solve the problem. So you don't have to look far to find a user that's going to give you some input. It may be a little bit more verbose than you're expecting, but you're going to get input. And so if you just look at, hey, who has the problem? You're going to have to turn off the flow of information that's coming into you, because they're going to just give you so much and you're going to uncover so much more. So just, I guess the message is get out of your office, get out of the ivory castle, and go find a user, because they're not very far away.
So as we talk about, I guess, finding that user, getting out of your office, I think that makes me really think about, so if you're a startup and you have any interest in going through this process and in this program, I guess, Marcus, just a couple of highlights on, if I'm that startup guy that, is considering what gets it over the hump for me, what really says, yes, I'm the right guy to go into this program because this is what I'm going to get out of it.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And really the compelling question for us is we're looking for companies that have a benefit and can provide a benefit to potential customers in Montgomery. And really our partner here is with BESPIN. So companies that have the ability to provide solutions for digital services or mobile applications for any place in the Air Force, because we want to be able to support the work that BESPIN's doing as a center of excellence. I think secondly, and really most importantly, is a company though that can serve a benefit to the Montgomery region. As Rashim talked about, this is really about people, and people start businesses, people build solutions, and so we're looking for companies that have an interest in finding a great region to operate in, with both a government, federal government, local government, regional government that are supportive, folks like the Chamber that are supportive in the Alabama Department of Commerce, but also can provide technology solutions and are looking to potentially staff up or scale their business.
Okay, so parting comments. And this is the same question for everyone. Since everyone on the roundtable really will impact Montgomery TechLab as a whole and will have influence on the program, what's one word that would describe what your organization will bring to the program? And I'll start with you, Rhea.
That is so mean, Sherry. So I was like, God. And you know when I don't know if people have played that game where it's like one word that comes to mind when I say the word like cheese, and you're like cheese, and so I was like Montgomery government, and like not really thinking. I'm gonna say I want to say federal, but that sounds like a cop out. So I'm going to go with sustaining. I don't really know. I get some slack though cut for me because I was the first.
That's cool. Okay, Rashim.
Culture.
I'm sorry, say again.
Culture.
Culture. Got it. Greg.
Delivery.
Good one. Guido.
Collaboration. Got to be collaboration.
Colt.
One word. It's tough. Challenges.
And Marcus.
I'm going to throw two out just for the sake of, a mulligan. One is access, and the second is empathy.
All right. So across everyone, if someone's looking to be a part of the program and to apply to come into Montgomery TechLab, they could expect to get guidance from a federal perspective, a better understanding of the culture in Montgomery, be focused on delivery, have the ability to collaborate with access to at least hit some of the challenges that are out there, but above all, having empathy for their customers, their clients, and their coworkers. That's it?
It's a pretty good summary.
Not bad,
Over.
not bad. Now,
well done.
I've got to say one, thank you to everybody that participated in the roundtable this afternoon. I think not only did we have an opportunity to, one, get out just Montgomery TechLab, but for people to have a better understanding of what digital transformation and what digital services and mobile application development will do, not just in Montgomery, not just within BES and BESPIN, but looking at the commercial sector as well as enterprise Air Force level wide. And I think that's something that we wanted to make sure that not just startup entrepreneurs understood, but also existing companies and industry, as well as citizens in Montgomery, to have an understanding of how this influence could really impact just the city itself, the county, and then also our pipeline and ability to attract wonderful talent to Montgomery and to bring local industry and other partners into play here. This is the first of several events like we talked about before. We actually will have an event every day for the next 13 days as we celebrate National Computer Science Education Week. And so it's not just events where you look traditional education and training for K through 12, while we are attracting and hitting a number of the students that we have across Montgomery, we have several activities that will actually bring to bear a lot of opportunities for local residents. And because everything is virtual, if you're not local to Montgomery, you can also really take advantage of those. And that's everything from a resume writing and interviewing skills workshop that we'll feature tomorrow, to some guest speakers that will actually speak on Agile, DevSecOps, and then also learning more about the US Space Force and the impacts that it will have in Montgomery. But these next 2 weeks for us are huge from a technology perspective, but it's a really good opportunity to just have a better understanding of what that technical influence and infrastructure looks like in Montgomery. So if you're interested in any of those activities, please feel free to check out techmgm.com under events, and you'll see a list of all of the events as well as details and registration links for those. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pinnacle Networks, for sponsoring today's Tech Forum, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. A recorded session will be available for those that missed out and want to at least gather some of the info and have a better understanding, but do know that the Montgomery TechLab applications are open, and that window is open until the end of December. So please get your application in, and we look forward to having you join the Montgomery community and help us with digital services transformation. Have a great afternoon.